Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine a new U.S. proposal that would require visa-free travelers to submit up to 5 years of social media history, a move expected to increase vetting requirements and raise the likelihood of entry denials. We also look at recent U.S. Navy flight operations in the Gulf of Venezuela and the seizure of a sanctioned oil tanker, actions that have increased pressure on the Maduro administration while also raising the risk of miscalculation. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess Greece's large-scale farmers' protests, which have blocked highways, ports, and airports. The latest round of Ukraine peace negotiations, where unresolved issues of territory and security guarantees remain central. The Southern Transitional Council's major territorial gains in Yemen, the attempted coup in Benin, and the renewed AFCM-23 offensive in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover the renewed border clashes between Thailand and Cambodia, which have resulted in mass displacement, cross-border strikes, and a growing risk of escalation. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the United States is proposing new entry rules that would require visa-free travelers to undergo a review of up to 5 years of social media history. On December 8th, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency released a proposal that would oblige travelers, including tourists, from countries eligible under the Visa Waiver Program to submit up to 5 years of social media history for review. The Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA, is the automated system that determines eligibility to travel to the United States under the Visa Waiver Program. 42 countries currently participate in the program, including EU member states, the UK, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The proposal is almost certainly part of the current U.S. administration's efforts to limit the entry of individuals whose views may be considered contrary to American national interests and to strengthen counter-terrorism screening. Plans may also include the submission of telephone numbers and email addresses covering the past decade, along with family members' names, as part of a broader attempt to map travelers' connections and patterns of life. However, applicants for an ESTA will, in effect, be consenting to the program's terms, allowing the United States to collect information that is often treated as personal data under domestic privacy laws. The proposal follows an earlier overhaul of entry vetting rules that applied to H-1B and H-4 visa applicants in December and to F, M, and J visa applicants in June. Opponents of the move have warned that the new rules risk creating additional processing delays, and that the lack of clarity around the grounds for entry denial may expose travelers to breaches of privacy or compel them to disclose sensitive information. The change has likely been justified in response to the recent shooting of 2 National Guard soldiers by an Afghan migrant, and is probably being planned ahead of the 2026 World Cup, which is expected to bring more than 1 million travelers to the United States. The new proposal, if implemented, would likely introduce additional travel risks for nationals from Visa Waiver Program countries who hold dual nationality, or for those whose passports do not fully reflect their travel histories as suggested by social media analysis. If that analysis indicates travel to countries deemed higher risk by the current U.S. administration, such as Iran, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, or Somalia, or suggests that applicants have not declared previous travel, affiliations, or online activity of interest to U.S. authorities, there is a high risk of entry being denied. Staying in the region, we turn to Venezuela, where U.S. reconnaissance flights and the seizure of a sanctioned tanker have increased pressure on the Maduro administration while raising the risk of miscalculation. On December 9th, U.S. Navy FA-18E Super Hornets and an EA-18G Growler flew extended orbits over the Gulf of Venezuela during a 40-minute sortie along the edge of Venezuelan airspace. the aircraft were visible on open-source flight tracking platforms, and the FA-18S approached to within 20 nautical miles of the Venezuelan coastline near Maracaibo. The EA-18G Growler, a specialist electronic warfare aircraft, conducted similar orbits to the north of the Gulf. All aircraft activated their transponders only when arriving near Venezuelan airspace, and their origin and destination were not displayed. The following day, U.S. naval forces conducted an operation to seize the very large crude carrier Skipper in the Caribbean Sea off the Venezuelan coast. The vessel was reportedly flying the Guyanese flag falsely and was preparing to conduct a ship-to-ship transfer of Venezuelan crude to a Panamanian-flagged vessel for onward delivery to Cuba. It had previously been sanctioned by the United States for its alleged role in facilitating illicit oil shipments from Venezuela that generated funds for Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. President Maduro has denounced the seizure as international piracy. Now, our intelligence assessment. The sortie marks the closest air operation to Venezuelan airspace to date and was highly likely intended to exert pressure on the Maduro administration, demonstrate U.S. capability, and conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ahead of any potential military engagement. Flying without the transponder activated, but then switching it on while near Venezuela, was likely meant to show that the United States can approach undetected, even with older, less stealthy aircraft. It also signaled that more advanced platforms or weapon systems, such as F-35s, could penetrate far deeper into Venezuelan airspace with very limited warning. The sorties were likely probing air defenses, with the EA-18G Growler tasked with monitoring Venezuela's responses. The aircraft can carry a suite of sensors and electronic warfare systems capable of detecting radar emissions, intercepting encrypted communications, and assessing the broader makeup and readiness of Venezuelan air defenses. Although this was only a limited operation, it may have provided valuable intelligence on gaps in Venezuela's detection capability, its response patterns, potential targets, and other vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a future conflict. Also, on December 9th, President Trump stated that President Maduro's days are numbered and refused to rule out deployment trips on Venezuelan soil. While this remains highly unlikely in the immediate future, and U.S. forces currently deployed to the Caribbean basin are not large enough to support a ground invasion, overt intelligence gathering operations will likely become more common as a means of maintaining pressure on the Maduro administration. However, such operations are also likely to increase the risk of miscalculation or unintended escalation, particularly if Venezuelan air defense units misinterpret U.S. probing activity as preparation for imminent strikes. The seizure of an oil tanker likely marks the greatest threat to the Maduro administration to date. Oil accounts for roughly 95% of Venezuela's exports, and illicit crude shipments have become a critical financial stream that has allowed Caracas to establish and maintain international allies. More importantly, oil revenues have enabled the Maduro administration to preserve regime stability by funding security and intelligence forces, bribing elites, and subsidizing domestic services to reduce the risk of internal unrest. If the United States continues operations against Venezuela's tanker fleet, it will likely help isolate Maduro diplomatically, undermine regime stability, and significantly increase pressure without requiring kinetic strikes on Venezuelan soil. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where large-scale farmers' protests in Greece have blocked major roads, ports, and airports across the country. Farmers in Greece, protesting the delayed payment of European Union agricultural subsidies and government-administered farm aid, have blocked several highways, border crossings, and access routes to major ports and airports. On December 8th, farmers staged demonstrations near the airports in Heraklion and Chania in Crete, where police used tear gas to disperse the crowds. Despite this, protesters entered the runway at Heraklion's main airport, forcing the temporary suspension of flights. Farmers also blocked access to the port of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos on December 8th. On December 9th, the Greek Supreme Court ordered prosecutors to intervene in farmers' demonstrations when protesters blocked roads, ports, or airports, stating that such actions could constitute crimes, including the disruption of road safety. Despite this, further protests were recorded after the ruling. On December 10th, farmers blocked access to the port of Volos, one of the largest ports on mainland Greece, with fishermen joining the protest by blocking maritime access with their vessels. Demonstrations also obstructed access to ports and airports in the Thessaloniki area in central Macedonia, as well as the Promokonas and Kipi border crossings with Bulgaria and Turkey. Smaller protests are continuing on roads across the country. Now, our assessment. The current round of Greek farmer protests marks one of the largest mobilizations in years, with an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 tractors involved. Farmers argue that delays in payments amount to collective punishment, leaving honest farmers in debt and unable to plant their fields for the next season. The subsidy scandals, which have also been linked to corruption among state employees, come after an outbreak of goat and sheep pox that prompted a mass cull of livestock in Greece. This has intensified the financial strain caused by delayed payments and heightened frustration within the farming community. The scale and disruption of the protests have forced the Greek government to hold emergency meetings, with the blockade of the port of Volos, the gateway to Greece's agricultural heartland in Thessaly, reportedly acting as the primary trigger. With multiple roads, ports, airports, and border crossings being intermittently blocked, the protests are almost certainly beginning to create a cascading effect. They are disrupting supply chains, tourism, and regional trade flows, and increasing pressure on the government to make concessions despite the Supreme Court's orders. The government has pledged to accelerate the disbursement of EU aid and domestic compensation. However, farmers have indicated that this is not enough, arguing that payments must be accompanied by structural reforms. Without immediate and improved support, along with firm commitments to reform, further protests are highly likely and may extend into the Christmas period to maximize pressure and publicity. Greece is also contending with taxi driver protests, student demonstrations, and broader public sector discontent. There is a realistic possibility that the scale and apparent success of the farmers' movement will embolden other groups to start or resume protests in an effort to increase pressure on the government. Now, we look at Ukraine, where recent peace talks have highlighted two unresolved issues: territorial concessions and credible security guarantees. Between December 4th and 6th, U.S. and Ukrainian delegations met in Miami, Florida, for what were described as marathon peace talks. U.S. negotiators reportedly pressed President Volodymyr Zelensky to accept a key Russian demand to cede the entirety of Donbass, including areas not currently occupied, during a phone call on December 6th, according to a Ukrainian official. Zelensky has indicated that the latest U.S. proposal involves trading control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant for those unoccupied parts of Donetsk Oblast. On December 8th, President Zelensky met the leaders of the UK, France, and Germany in London. The meeting concluded with a reiterated, unified European position that no peace deal should compromise Ukraine's territorial integrity or sovereignty, and that any agreement must include robust security guarantees and a full ceasefire. Zelensky stated on December 9th that Ukraine and its European allies will soon present refined peace plan documents to the United States for review. Finnish President Alexander Stubb noted that the documents comprise three parts: a 20-point peace framework agreement, a set of security guarantees, and a post-war reconstruction plan. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. In mid-November, the 28-point peace plan, drafted by Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, included multiple concessions that Kyiv deemed unacceptable. After negotiations in late November and early December with European involvement, Kyiv gave provisional agreement to a revised 20-point plan, pending clarification of several details. Following the 2nd of December talks between President Vladimir Putin and U.S. envoys in Moscow, the latest diplomatic developments in Miami have highly likely failed to resolve the two most fundamental issues in establishing peace: the Kremlin's demand that Ukraine cede the entire Donbass, including currently unoccupied parts of Donetsk, and Kyiv's insistence on credible security guarantees. Moscow's demand for a full Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk Oblast would likely pose an existential threat to Ukraine's sovereignty if realized. Donetsk has seen the most intense fighting and the largest battles of the war, with Ukrainian forces inflicting heavy casualties on Russian troops. The 7 fortified cities in Donetsk that remain under Ukrainian control, excluding Pokrovsk, which almost certainly still has Ukrainian defenders in the north, but is highly likely to be fully captured soon, include the extensive Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration and are often described as the fortress belt. If Ukraine were to cede this fortress belt to Russia, it would be giving up its most defensible line and exposing less fortified areas to any potential future Russian advances. Furthermore, without a ceasefire in place, withdrawing Ukrainian forces would be highly vulnerable to Russian attack. In the 28-point plan, a ceasefire would only take effect once both sides had withdrawn to agreed positions for the start of the agreement's implementation. It is therefore highly likely that the only circumstances under which Kyiv could agree to such a withdrawal would involve credible security guarantees against any future Russian invasion, as well as a reliable ceasefire that would prevent attacks on withdrawing forces. During the war and the subsequent negotiations, several potential security guarantees for Ukraine have been proposed. Within the 28-point plan, there is a provision stating that Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. In exchange for the United States receiving compensation for providing such a guarantee, the draft plan notes that if Russia invades Ukraine, all global sanctions will be reinstated, and more significantly, there will be a decisive and coordinated military response. However, the plan also stipulates that NATO members cannot station troops in Ukraine and that European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland, which is already the case. Given the vague nature of these provisions, Kyiv will require far more ironclad guarantees. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which provided security assurances in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal, proved ineffective in both 2014 and 2022. As a result, President Zelensky has stated that he wants U.S. guarantees to be enshrined in law through approval by Congress. In response to the pressure over territorial concessions, President Zelensky has maintained a hard line by referring to law, stating that Ukraine cannot cede territory under its constitution or under international and moral law. However, both of the main points of friction in the negotiations, territory and security guarantees, ultimately relate to Kyiv's likely central priority in any peace agreement: ensuring that Ukraine's sovereignty is protected over the long term. The Kremlin is unlikely to accept a now hostile Ukraine on its border if that state is backed by ironclad security guarantees. As negotiations continue, Russian forces will highly likely maintain maximum military pressure at the front lines and through aerial strikes, particularly against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. By sustaining this pressure, Moscow will highly likely continue to pursue its maximalist objectives, while signaling that if Ukraine does not concede to its demands, Russian forces will eventually be able to impose them by force. Staying in the region in Yemen, the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council has launched a major offensive, seizing control of much of the country's south in a significant shift in the balance of power. On December 8th, the UAE-backed separatist group, the Southern Transitional Council, announced that it had taken broad control of Yemen's 8 southern governorates. In an offensive initially launched on December 2nd and named Operation Promising Future, STC forces captured several key areas in Hadramaut, including the cities of Seyun and Tarim, as well as parts of Marrah Governorate. having also carried out operations in Aden, where the Saudi-backed internationally recognized government is based under the Presidential Leadership Council. Both the head of the council, Rashad al-Alimi, and Prime Minister Salim Saleh bin Braik left the city. Al-Alimi, who had been in Riyadh on December 7th, released a statement on December 8th saying that the STC offensive had undermined the legitimacy of the internationally recognized government and violated the Saudi-mediated STC-IRG power-sharing agreement signed in 2019. Now our intelligence assessment. Yemen's territory is now divided between the Houthi movement, which controls most of the pre-1990 North Yemen and around 70 to 80% of the population, the Southern Transitional Council, and the Saudi-backed internationally recognized government. Despite the 2019 Riyadh Agreement establishing a power-sharing arrangement between the STC and the IRG, STC forces have retained considerable autonomy. It is almost certain that Operation Promising Future marks the most significant shift in power in Yemen since the 2022 UN-brokered ceasefire with the Houthis, which has de facto held since then. In a press briefing on December 4th, senior STC official Amr Bid stated that the council was consulting both Yemeni and international partners on the potential launch of a ground offensive against the Houthis. During the March-May 2025 campaign of U.S. strikes against the Houthis, known as Operation Rough Rider, the Wall Street Journal was briefed by Yemeni and U.S. officials that UAE-backed Yemeni factions, almost certainly referring to the STC, were planning a ground offensive against the Houthis, reportedly with advice from private American security contractors. It is currently unclear where relations between the STC and the internationally recognized government now stand. Although Amr Bid has said that nothing has changed in the Presidential Leadership Council and that it is business as usual, the STC remains a secessionist movement whose leader, Idaris al-Zubaydi, called as recently as October for the creation of a new state called South Arabia. In an interview, al-Zubaydi said that while the STC and the IRG were in a federal transition phase, united by the need to confront the Houthis, their ultimate goal is a two-state solution, north and south. There have been multiple reports of the South Yemen flag, the pre-unification flag of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, replacing the IRG flag in seized areas. This is a key indicator that the STC is no longer recognizing the authority of the IRG. There is a realistic possibility that the STC will soon announce the establishment of a new state of South Arabia. The developments have highly likely increased tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi forces have withdrawn from multiple areas in southern Yemen, and the UAE-backed STC has directly confronted Saudi-backed tribal forces in Hadramaut, for example. The Saudi-led coalition's involvement in Yemen's civil war incurred considerable reputational and economic costs for Riyadh, and it is likely very reluctant to re-engage in further conflict. The sudden surge by the STC poses a major threat to the Houthis, as the council has now potentially unified much of the south under a single flag. A reignition of the civil war would not only dramatically alter Yemen's security environment, but also pose considerable risks of Houthi long-range attacks against Gulf states, particularly the UAE, given its direct sponsorship of the STC. During the 2014 to 2022 civil war, the Houthis launched multiple attacks on targets in the UAE. These included a long-range drone and ballistic missile strike in January 2022, which hit fuel trucks near Abu Dhabi International Airport, killing 3 civilians. Next, we move to Benin, where a military faction attempted to seize power, prompting a strong response from national forces and ECOWAS. On December 7th, a military faction calling itself the Military Committee for Refoundation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Tigri Pascal, appeared on Benin state television and announced the dissolution of the government and national institutions, the suspension of the constitution, and the closure of land, air, and sea borders. Gunfire was also heard near the presidential residence in Cotonou. Shortly afterwards, President Patrice Talon declared that the situation was totally under control, while Interior Minister Alassane Seydou stated that a small group of soldiers launched a mutiny to destabilize the state and its institutions. But that faced with this situation, the Beninese armed forces and their leadership, true to their oath, remained committed to the republic. Foreign Minister Olusegun Ajadi-Bakari added that the soldiers had only gained control of state television. 14 people were reported to have been arrested. Talon issued 2 requests for assistance to Nigeria's government, prompting its military to deploy fighter jets to take control of Benin's airspace and conduct airstrikes. The Economic Community of West African States condemned the coup attempt and pledged to support the government by all means necessary. It subsequently deployed part of its standby force to target the military faction. Calm had returned to Cotonou by December 8th, though a heavy security presence remained on the streets. 2 senior military officers who had been taken hostage by the putschists were released. Immediately following the coup attempt, the U.S. Embassy in Benin urged residents to avoid the area, specifically Cotonou and areas near the presidential compound. This advice was subsequently lifted. Now our assessment. Benin has not experienced a successful coup since 1972, the last in a sequence of 9 attempts made during the 15 years after its 1960 independence from France, a period that made the country one of sub-Saharan Africa's most coup-prone states. Despite this history, Benin has in recent years become a model case for democracy, with decades of rising living standards and strong economic growth. The 2025 figure reached 7.5%. However, President Talon's growing authoritarianism, marked by constraints on the opposition since he took office in 2016, and an alleged foiled coup plot in January 2024, has contributed to a mounting sense of democratic backsliding. A presidential election is scheduled for April 2026, but it will take place under reduced levels of electoral competition and freedom of expression. A growing sense of instability has been exacerbated by increasing jihadist violence in the northern regions, where Jama'a Nusrat ul-Islam wa al-Muslimin has established a presence near the border. The putschists cited this as a key reason for their attempted coup, referring to the ignorance and neglect of the situation of our brothers in arms who have fallen at the front. In April 2025, the group killed at least 54 soldiers stationed near the border with Burkina Faso. JNIM's insurgency has been most active in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, all of which have experienced successful coups in recent years, and the group is seeking to expand its presence into coastal West Africa. Its growing foothold in the border regions of countries including Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Senegal almost certainly raises the risk of further coup attempts across the region. This coup attempt comes shortly after a successful coup in Guinea-Bissau on November 26th and marks the latest in a series of takeovers along Africa's so-called coup belt, which includes Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. ECOWAS's rapid response to the Benin attempt was almost certainly shaped by the recent events in Guinea-Bissau. The organization has highly likely learned from its experience after the Niger coup, when it threatened intervention but moved too slowly to take any preventive measures before the takeover was completed. Benin will highly likely serve as a model for any other coup attempts in the region. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, AFCM-23 rebels have continued their rapid advance, with reports that the group has entered Uvira near the Burundian border. On the evening of December 9th, Rwanda-backed AFCM-23 rebels reportedly entered Uvira, after civilian and military authorities had fled earlier in the day. South Kivu Governor Jean-Jacques Purusi dismissed the reports as completely unfounded rumors. The group had advanced quickly through South Kivu, claiming to have captured Sangje along the N5 highway 2 days earlier, roughly 30 kilometers from Uvira, with fighting reported in Kaliba, just 15 kilometers from the city, on December 9th. Sanga's capture came shortly after the rebels seized Luvungi on the same day. AFCM-23's spokesperson, Lawrence Kanyuka, announced on December 10th that the group had taken control of Uvira. According to the United Nations, at least 200,000 people have fled their homes, with at least 74 killed. This marks a renewed AFCM-23 push to the south. Burundi had previously warned that the group intended to take the city by December 25th, before advancing along Lake Tanganyika towards Kalemie, 270 kilometers to the south. The United States, the European Union, and 8 other European countries have called for a halt to the fighting and have accused Rwanda of supporting the offensive. Following the likely capture of Uvira, the FCDO updated its foreign travel advice for Burundi, advising against all but essential travel to the former Bujumbura Meri province, including the city of Bujumbura, and to the area of the former Bujumbura rural province, east of the Rusizi River. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. In the week-long offensive launched from Kamanyola, AFCM-23 has advanced approximately 50 kilometers across the Rusizi Plain. Uvira has the second-largest population in South Kivu and serves as a major transportation hub, with direct access to Burundi's commercial capital, Bujumbura, across the border. The group's likely capture of Uvira is highly likely to intensify population displacement, with many residents expected to flee into Burundi. The fall of the city will almost certainly heighten concern in Burundi, whose security forces have stated that the country has closed its border with the DRC. The renewed offensive is almost certainly indicative of the limitations of the US-mediated DRC-Rwanda peace agreement, which was signed in Washington on December 4th. The deal was largely symbolic, with peace in the DRC almost certainly dependent on the Qatar-mediated DRC-AFCM-23 peace talks. AFCM-23's renewed offensive is highly likely intended as a land grab to consolidate more territory and increase the group's leverage ahead of further negotiations, despite its signing of a peace framework agreement in November. The renewed offensive almost certainly risks the collapse of the ongoing talks and is likely to deepen the mistrust between the two sides. In January 2025, AFCM-23's capture of Goma triggered a day of violent unrest in Kinshasa, where protesters targeted the embassies of France, the United States, Rwanda, Belgium, the Netherlands, Kenya, and Uganda. Social media footage also showed demonstrators attacking foreigners. There is a realistic possibility that the group's capture of Uvira will spark further unrest in Kinshasa, driven by frustration over the government's perceived ineffectiveness and over foreign influence in the DRC. The offensive has unfolded during the DRC and Rwanda's signing of a US-mediated peace agreement, underscoring that peace in the DRC is almost certainly more dependent on the Qatar-mediated DRC-AFCM-23 process. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, hostilities between Thailand and Cambodia have resumed, resulting in significant casualties, mass evacuations, and widespread disruption on both sides of the border. On December 7th, border clashes between the two countries restarted, leading to heavy casualties and large-scale evacuations. Both governments denied responsibility for initiating the latest fighting, with each accusing the other of violating existing ceasefire agreements. Cambodia's defense ministry reported that 9 civilians, including an infant, had been killed and 46 injured by Thai attacks. The Thai military stated that 4 of its soldiers had died and 68 were injured, while claiming that 89 Cambodian soldiers were also killed. Both sides have traded accusations of targeting civilians and of using heavy weaponry. Cambodian officials have further accused the Thai military of firing toxic gas into residential areas in Ubay Choan in Banteay Menchi province. Both militaries have carried out cross-border attacks, with Thailand deploying F-16 fighter jets in response to Cambodian rocket artillery fire. The Thai military also announced plans to demolish the Stung Matuk Bridge in Cambodia's Pusat province, alleging that it was being used to transport artillery, and ordered civilians to evacuate the area. Chanthaburi is reportedly the only Thai province not directly affected by the armed clashes. On December 9th, Thai Navy Marines launched a counter-offensive in Trat province to reclaim territory seized by Cambodian forces. Aerial images had allegedly shown Cambodia reinforcing the area with troops and weaponry. Thai authorities reported that more than 170,000 people had been evacuated to shelters in border provinces, with additional reports indicating that nearly 430,000 residents have been displaced since the fighting resumed. Cambodian authorities have stated that 101,229 people have been evacuated across 5 provinces. Hospitals and schools on both sides of the border have been forced to close due to the violence. On December 10th, the Thai military reported that Cambodian rockets had landed near Phanom Dong Rak Hospital in Surin and accused Cambodia of deliberately targeting the facility. Curfews and evacuation orders have been imposed in Thailand's Sa Kaeo, Surin, Sisaket, and Ubon Ratchathani provinces, with temporary shelters established for evacuees. The Thai government has also heightened security and warned of suspected Cambodian spies operating in border areas. All land border crossings between the two countries have been suspended. China and Malaysia have urged restraint, while Thailand's Prime Minister has ruled out negotiations, insisting that Cambodia comply with Thai demands. Cambodia has announced its withdrawal from the 2025 Southeast Asia Games in Thailand due to the ongoing conflict. The United States has asked both sides to cease hostilities immediately and to follow the de-escalatory measures set out in the US-brokered October peace accord. Now for our intelligence assessment. The dispute originates from a 1904 colonial-era agreement between France and Siam that used the watershed principle to define the border. However, a later French-drawn map placed the Preah Vihear Temple on the Cambodian side. The International Court of Justice ultimately ruled in Cambodia's favor. Tensions in the disputed area have periodically escalated, most notably in 2008 and again in 2011, following armed skirmishes between Cambodian and Thai troops. Tensions flared again on July 24, 2025, with violence breaking out along multiple border sectors. The two sides exchanged artillery and rocket fire, as well as heavy weaponry and airstrikes. The conflict displaced more than 300,000 civilians across Thailand and Cambodia, and many villages, schools, and civilian buildings were damaged. By July 28th, both sides agreed to a ceasefire following Malaysia-mediated peace talks, supported by additional pressure from the United States and China. The US-brokered Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord was signed by both countries in October. Under the agreement, both sides committed to refrain from the threat or use of force, and to settle disputes peacefully under international law. They also agreed to withdraw heavy weapons from border zones, establish a monitoring mechanism, and carry out demining and clearance of unexploded ordnance. Further clashes are highly likely in the short term. While the conflict has so far remained largely confined to the border areas, the mutual accusations of civilian targeting, along with claims of toxic gas use, almost certainly increase the risk that towns and cities further from the border could be struck. Such allegations also raise the likelihood of tit-for-tat actions, including the deliberate targeting of hospitals or other civilian infrastructure. President Donald Trump has said he will make a phone call to stop the clashes. The United States could threaten sanctions against the belligerents, which would almost certainly affect both economies and could provide a diplomatic off-ramp for renewed negotiations. There is a realistic possibility that protests will emerge in Bangkok and Phnom Penh, and martial law may be imposed if tensions continue to escalate. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.